3. Liability laws. Their pagan origin. Medical Report Number 2, written April 10th, 1974. Very commonly, historians praise ancient medical practice and declare that its corruption was the fault of Christianity. Prior to the rise of Christianity, medicine was supposedly making steady progress, and it was the Christians who brought this to a halt. The decline, however, in ancient medicine began in the 3rd century BC, long before the birth of the Church. J. Bougeot, Medicine in René Taton, editor, History of Science, Ancient and Medieval Science from the Beginning to 1450, New York, Basic Books, 1957, 1963, page 365. According to Dr. Entralgo, it was in fact Christianity which rescued medicine from sterile presuppositions. Pedro L. Entralgo, Mind and Body, Psychosomatic Pathology, A Short History of the Evolution of Medieval Thought, New York, P.J. Kennedy and Sons, N.D. In the pagan tradition, the doctor was a god or a semi-incarnate agent of a god, such as Asclepios. Medicine was an occult practice. Medical practice in the healing tradition of the Asclepia of the Greeks was by oracles. Asclepios was the chief Greek god of healing. He was also the first Greek god to be received into the Roman pantheon, indicating the importance of healing to the Romans. Because paganism saw medical practice as a form of divine manifestation, it expected too much of the doctor. The gods being very powerful, it followed that when the gods chose, they could do almost whatever they would. Thus, if an agent of the gods did not heal you, it meant ill will on his part, because all the resources of the god were his to command. The result was a pagan doctrine of the physician's liability. Liability was seen as commensurate to power, and thus the doctrine of total liability was common to paganism. If the patient died, it was assumed to be the doctor's fault because his power to heal was proportionate to his god's power. A doctor who lost his patient could lose his life, or at least his right hand. This does not mean that such executions or mutilations were commonplace, although they did occur. The ancient physician was also a good psychologist who could deflect blame and break with his patient before death. In the 1940s, when I was for 8.5 years on an American Indian reservation, I saw this ancient method in practice. The medicine men claimed occult powers, and they never lost a patient in those days. As astute men, they could see a patient slipping away, and they recognized the patient's awareness of his condition. They would provoke a quarrel in which the fearful and doubting patient would be manipulated into being the aggressor, and then would terminate the treatment, saying, in so many words, "So, you don't want me? It's the white doctor you want, is it? Well, go to him and see if he can do you any good. But don't say I didn't warn you about what would happen if you doubted me and left me." The medicine man would then leave in indignation, and the hapless patient would be taken to the white man's doctor, usually to die. As a result, the white doctor acquired a poor reputation, whatever its skills, and the medicine man a remarkable statistical record of no lost patients. No one could then accuse the medicine man of evil intent, and, as for the white doctor, everyone knew, who trusted in medicine men, that all white men were anti-Indian in some degree. The ancient pagan doctor operated on the same premise. He claimed occult and semi-divine powers, and he was thus exposed to an equally great liability. His liability was not that of a man, but of a semi-divine being. Moreover, it was precisely the element of naturalism in pagan antiquity which led to this view of the physician. There was no true doctrine of a transcendent God, but only of gods who were divinized heroes, so that men could point to the grave of Zeus, for example, and various cities claimed association with him during his lifetime. The pagan doctrine was formalized in Pliny's statement, quote, "Deity only means nature," end quote. The hero who through his power, or the physician who through his knowledge of medicine commanded nature, was thus in some sense a divine being and had a measure of infallibility. His liability then was not the liability of a man, but of a superman, a hero, or a divine being. The result was a paradox. The more naturalistic the pagan physician became, the more he saw himself and was seen by others as a godlike being. Thus, the doctor of the Greco-Roman world, the more his practical knowledge grew, the more authoritarian he became. He readily turned also to charms and amulets because magic was seen as a means of controlling nature. Hebrew medical history, because it did not confuse God and nature, avoided, on the whole, the peril of occultism and magic. Because the modern world so greatly idealizes Greek civilization, it failed to see the serious and unavoidable defects in its politics, philosophy, or medicine. Our concern now, however, is with the liability concept. Limited liability is a modern concept, one which has become common only in the last 125 years. There are serious defects in the concept which cannot be dealt with here. See R.J. Rushdoony, Politics of Guilt and Pity, Nutley, New Jersey, Craig Press, 1970, pages 254 to 262, and R.J. Rushdoony, The Institutes of Biblical Law, Nutley, New Jersey, Craig Press, 1973, pages 104 to 106, 273 and 274, 463 and 467, 627, 664 to 669. The idea of limited liability leads to socialism. It does not eliminate liability, but simply transfers it from the individual to the group. The idea of unlimited liability, however, is of two kinds. First, in the Hebraic or biblical tradition, liability is unlimited, but it is not total. Man is not a god. He cannot at any point be ascribed total responsibility for all things. To expect more of a man than a man can do, or to expect inerrancy and infallibility, is a serious error and puts an impossible burden on men and society. The human factor is thus inescapable. Men can do their best and no more. Applied to medicine, this doctrine means that, when I choose a doctor, I cannot expect him to work miracles. Moreover, I am responsible for choosing him, so I cannot complain when his abilities are not equal to the medical problem. There is a difference between criminal action and human inadequacy. The implications of this biblical concept were enormous. The pagan doctrine of total liability receded, and until the recent revival of paganism, liability suits were a rarity. Second, in the pagan tradition, total and unlimited liability falls on the doctor. Any and all failures by the doctor to heal represent criminal intent or negligence, and hence require prosecution in terms of criminal law. Thus, whether it was the Code of Hammurabi, Greek law, or any other pagan tradition, the failures of the doctor had a place in criminal law. Aristotle's lectures to his students were private and esoteric, unlike his published works, and he claimed descent from Asclepius. Such a claim meant special powers and secret knowledge. Instead of magic being an early aspect of medicine, which fell by the wayside as rationalism developed, magic was a late development which arose with rationalism. L. Bourgi admits that in Greece, for example, quote, "This magical kind of medicine was not part of the original tradition, and its full development occurred very much later." End quote. L. Bourgi, Greek Medicine from the Beginning to the End of the Classical Period, in Taton, History of Science, page 245. Again, in the 20th century, we have seen simultaneously a return to magic and occultism, and also of severe malpractice suits against doctors. These malpractice suits commonly imply the pagan approach to medical liability and an ancient pagan distrust of the medical practitioner. Because historians write from the presupposition of the myth of evolution, they discard much data. In approaching medical history, they see magic as an early phase which was later abandoned as rationalism developed. The fact is that the two grew side by side. Bourgi merely notes this fact and ignores it. Others note with surprise that Homer's Iliad has a sounder knowledge of medicine than the more advanced Greek civilization of later centuries, when both rationalism and magic flourished. What was the relationship of the two, and why is it that our age, ostensibly emancipated, is turning again to magic and to a magical demand from doctors? The rationalism involved in both cases is of a particular kind. It was a naturalistic rationalism which, as Pliny later stated it, reduced God to nature and expert man to the status of the expression of the powers of nature. Aristotle's esotericism and his science are inseparable because there was nothing beyond nature for Aristotle. This meant that an understanding and control of nature placed a man above the common herd. Knowledge was power to be used to control man and to train elite men. When Alexander the Great, whose tutor Aristotle had been, heard of the publication of some lectures of Aristotle, he protested, saying, "How shall we be any better than the rest?" End quote. Aristotle assured him that the esoteric aspects of his science were still secret. Quote, "The private lessons are both published and not published. Nobody will be able to understand them except those who have had the oral instruction." End quote. Benjamin Farrington, Greek Science, Its Meaning for Us, Volume 2, Penguin Books, 1945-1949, pages 15 and 16. Alexander's self-deification is a development of the implications of the Greek and pagan traditions. An inscription under a statue of Alexander read, "I hold the earth." A similar motto could describe the Greek scientists, "I hold the sciences." Magic, whether in its sophisticated or naive and primitive forms, is the attempt by man to control man, nature, and whatever powers may be. Because power and control were so basic to ancient medicine, the practitioner was feared and distrusted. Certain strands in modern psychology are in this ancient magical tradition of power and control, as witness the behaviorists and B.F. Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity, 1971. There have also been elements of this in medical research, but medical practitioners, whatever their personal faith, have not been much affected by this pagan tradition. The biblical faith, as it entered into the mainstream of history, altered the idea of medical practice. Because salvation is basic to biblical faith, and salvation means healing, physical and spiritual, a new emphasis was added. Moreover, because it is so central to biblical faith, quote, "to know the Lord," end quote, it became important in ancient Israel as well as in the Christian tradition to acquire knowledge of God and all his works. Christian and Hebraic civilizations have thus been unique in their emphasis on learning, on knowledge. Practically, what this meant for medicine was an emphasis on knowledge and healing. A long struggle ensued as medicine sought to cast off the sterile and pagan presuppositions of Greek medicine, and the result has been a remarkable one. The doctor has become, like the rabbi and the pastor, a priestly figure in this tradition, as against the godlike magical practitioner of paganism. One of the first results of this changed status of the doctor was the end of total liability and a regard for the doctor as one who sought to help men rather than to exercise power and control in and over them. The return of paganism has seen a return of the pagan attitude towards medical liability. In 1973, some 10,000 medical malpractice cases were filed in the United States. Granted that many of these were nuisance suits filed by people ready to exert pressure on an insurance company, still, it must be said, while 30 years ago insurance companies had their share of such suits, they virtually did not exist where medical practice was concerned. Juries were not favourable to suits against doctors in those days. They are today. Then the doctor was viewed with trust, now too often with suspicion. It would be interesting to know where those suits were filed. The Journal of the Medical Association of the State of Alabama says that a few states account for well over half of these cases, and California for 2,500 pending medical malpractice cases. California is a state in which the modern mood dominates, and magic and occultism flourish. I would suggest that the other states in which medical malpractice cases flourish will be similar to California in their modernity and magic, and that the cities which show the most cases will have a like complexion. I suspect that more conservative and churchy areas of strong Christian faith will show the least number of such cases, or virtually none. The claims which go to trial are only 1 in 10, which means that the malpractice suit is still largely a nuisance, a low and ugly one. In many areas, the main function of the malpractice suit is to damage the reputation of the doctor and of medicine in general, whether or not it goes to court, and whether or not the plaintiff loses. With all too many people in malpractice suits, the doctor cannot win. Common observations by such people include the following. The doctors all stick together, so you can't prove anything against a doctor because no doctor will back you up. Mrs. Doe has never been the same since that doctor got a hold of her, but try and prove anything against a doctor. And so on and on. The attack on doctors is fed by a stream of statements from, quote, medical experts, end quote, and medical school faculty members who try to promote their goals for medicine by berating the practitioner. In the past month, I saw 2 newspaper articles citing medical experts on the backwardness of practicing doctors. A lawyer, Truman Hobbs, writing on, quote, fire, pestilence, flood, and medical malpractice suits, end quote, in the March 1974 Journal of the Medical Association of the State of Alabama, quotes Dr. Paul Hawley, former director of the American College of Surgeons, as stating, quote, 1/2 of the surgical operations in the United States are performed by doctors who are untrained or inadequately trained to undertake surgery, end quote. Dr. Hawley no doubt has in mind a high standard of surgical practice as his standard, so that, in terms of his ideal, half of the operations and doctors represent an unacceptable standard in his eyes. If, however, his statement were taken at face value, it would mean that a lot of butchery goes on in the name of medicine. This I refuse to believe. I am sure most doctors can point to inadequate practitioners, but such practitioners are a minority. The overwhelming majority of operations are successful and represent a practicing competence, if not an ideal one. Such statements as that of Dr. Hawley have their place as an in-group nudge for improved standards and up-to-date competence. But in an age already given to demanding perfection and total competence from doctors, it is a rather dangerous statement to make, in that it leads to highly erroneous conclusions. Implicit in the idea of total liability is a demand for total competence to overcome all problems, and a suspicion of failure. During the years that I was a missionary and a pastor, because of my unusual situations, I had an unusually large number of hospital and sickbed visitations to make, and more funerals in a few years than most pastors have in a lifetime, a few hundred or more in all. I talked with many seriously ill and dying people, and was often startled by their insane, and that is the necessary word, demand for miraculous healing. Men and women in their 80s, having had a long and full life, will insist that the doctor is somehow worthless or malevolent because he does not restore them to health. I found this out because, as I tried to prepare them for death, all their hidden hatred would then spill out. To cite another example, a woman whose family business it was to make orthopedic shoes found, in the many years of this business with her father and then alone, that there were almost no satisfied customers. What the patients actually wanted from their doctor and from the orthopedic shoemakers was a removal of all their disabilities, and anything short of that they resented. What they hesitated to tell the doctor, they told the hard-working woman, Mrs. L.S., as she tried to help them. What they wanted, she quickly recognized, was magic, and lacking that, they manifested an ugly and vicious disposition. The pagan patients of old tolerated no failures. the doctor's life could be demanded for failure. The modern mood is on the same track of total liability. As a result, the demand is for more and more control over medicine and more legislation to ensure that the patient gets all the benefits and the doctor all the penalties. Medical practice has never been more competent, and yet the hostility grows. Is this an overstatement? I do not think so. The reaction of one substantial businessman who is not on our mailing list to our Chalcedon Medical Report number 1 was one of the most intense anger and rage. The man, a modern irreligious individual, regarded the report as a fraudulent attempt to prop up a group of blood-sucking leeches, and so on and on. He especially resented, with more than a little anger, the title of the report, "The Medical Profession as a Priestly Calling." The medical profession, he held, had to be treated as civil servants, kept firmly in line and made fully liable for all their mistakes. Doctors are today still much loved by those who, in the Hebrew Christian tradition, see them as healers with a priestly function. Those who see the doctor in pagan terms as one whose goal is power and control regard the doctor with hostility. Medical practice cannot, by its very nature, escape the religious implications and overtones. It must thus recognize its religious presuppositions and develop them. It must recognize that medical practice offers more than medicine. It offers a personal and pastoral function in relationship to healing. Over 6 months ago, my daughter and son-in-law moved from this area to a community over 50 miles away. They return here regularly for 3 reasons: to visit us, to attend church, and to see their doctor. This is not an accidental correlation. It is basic to the biblical tradition and its concept of the doctor.